Hello, my name's Morgan Howe. I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we live. I would like to pay my respects to the Wiradjuri elders and to all the elders of First Nations communities, past, present and emerging. And I acknowledge the continuity of all Australian First Nation peoples and their continuous connection to country. So today I'll be presenting a reflection on how my standpoint has changed according to the Bennett model. So for assessment 1, I positioned my standpoint between minimisation and acceptance. I identified that according to the minimisation category, I perceived superficial cultural differences as variations on the shared universal themes of humanity, and also that I had a desire to project similarity. Also, according to the acceptance category, I identified that I am curious about cultures and cultural differences. But the concept that really shook me out of minimisation was Dirk Spenneman's lecture regarding the reburial of Mungo Man. My first reaction to that was, this relic is 30 to 40,000 years old. He belongs with science, like we can learn so much for him. Why is he being returned to country? So the lecture challenged my positioning that Western science is the modern and correct knowledge system, and my belief was a shared universal theme. The lecture repositioned me to understand that the act of scientific inquiry positions Western culture as right and educated and modern, perpetuates the idea that Indigenous cultures are ancient and primitive and need to be studied. So the Darwinian theories embedded in scientific and social discourse have led me to believe that the modern dominant culture and science is a universal belief. And this has distanced me from the real human and emotional and spiritual nature of grave sites, of burials, of Indigenous continued connection to these burials over tens of thousands of years. Mungo Man was someone's grandfather, great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, and I was emotionally distant from that. In fact, that week I was actually questioning whether I should go and see Mungo National Park, but coming to this lecture completely changed my mind. I would have treated that place as a museum and not as a grave to be visited. So I must learn about the intentions behind scientific inquiry and explore with empathy and any potential cultural and spiritual differences in my future practice. So then the next thing that really changed my view was McNiven and Russell's reading. So I learnt that it challenged the context in which I was still struggling to accept cultural differences by introducing the idea that the Indigenous other was represented as ancient to help legitimise colonial settlement of Indigenous lands, sharing the same space by sharing different time periods, ancient and modern. Thus, allochronism helps define away the morally problematic issue of coevality and usurpation by making colonialism a process of settling vacant temporal space. It took a bit for me to get my head around, but it was the concept that I needed to understand why I had two streams of thought. So one stream of thought was this racially constructed paradigm that perpetuated the psychological terra nullius, or the propaganda, or the old standpoint. And then the second train of thought was this emerging understanding that Indigenous cultures are as complex as my own. But it's because of this allochronism that it's constructed two different time frames in my mind. So learning this, it's helped me to further deconstruct any lingering otherness, because at the end of the day, it's Enlightenment theory. It's having an ancient and a modern space in my conceptual thought. So I want to keep learning these things so that I can recognise and acknowledge them and stop myself from minimising Indigenous cultural differences. So I believe that those have moved me firmly into acceptance and closer to adaptation on the Bennett model. So when it comes to Indigenous and Indigenist perspectives, my understanding is that in regards to environmental studies, it's fundamentally concerned with justice and self-determination for Indigenous communities to practice their own cultures and knowledge and to be recognised. So as we face down climate change, it's more apparent that we need this and to adopt Indigenous worldviews as they are vital for everyone's survival. So according to Irene Watson in her Caldwinieri, the idea of justice is very different to Western judicial systems. So undressed from colonialism, the concept of raw law is not imposed, but lived. So law is a practice that includes obligations to renew land. It involves lateral thinking, balance, renewal, justice, harmony, relationships, and has this concept of eternal time. So these custodial obligations bind future generations to the present, where the present communities are obligated to protect the land using sustainable practices to ensure there's enough resources for future generations. So it's like this sustainable way to sustain sustainable practices. I think I said that right. This allows for safe and sustainable fire management, fish farming, foraging, and shelter building. And it comes from a place of love and kinship rather than obligation and fear of punishment. So with colonial justice, so everything's owned, the land is a resource, it's adversarial, there's only one-way exchanges, it's binary, and time is only linear. So it seems that in these constructs we've distanced ourselves even more from nature, and using this thinking we've potentially already consumed our own future. So personally, I wish to try to embody more Indigenous sustainable practices in my career. However, I recognise that I might need to be careful about what knowledge I have the right to inquire. So when it comes to igniculture and burning, the practice within Indigenous land management is like this prime example of an environmental technique that is perfectly suited for our environment, for land management. However, because it is embedded so deeply in cultural and spiritual practice, and every area requires different knowledge, then the question of who owns the knowledge in terms of intellectual property, copyright law would need to be established so that the right group can be reimbursed for the right knowledge. So then if I am not allowed to study igniculture, how could I become a better ally to promote Indigenous land management? How can I create justice for the environment and all of its communities, past, present, and future? So I think that by implementing my understanding of Indigenous perspectives and asking these types of questions, I think I will become a more holistic environmental scientist. So this course has definitely helped me emotionally connect with the subject material. I can no longer minimise historical facts as relic of some other's past, but rather very painful, dark platforms of human experiences upon which our current government has established itself. It is ongoing and brutal, and this deconstruction of psychological terra nullius is not only vital for the survival of Indigenous cultures, languages, and knowledge, but also vital for the survival of humans, because we need to recognise and start adopting Indigenous knowledge in the face of climate change. So I have had to admit to myself that there is still a part of me that positions people racially in a hierarchy, and positions Indigenous people as tribal, other, and excluded from modernity. I understand that this thinking has been reinforced by Christianity, museums, anthropology, my education, the media, the government, and like stereotyping artists. But by acknowledging this, I can effectively transform my thinking away from black and white and into dialectical form, where I can adopt an acceptance and ethno-relative curiosity of cultural differences. So I think that this class has helped me deconstruct how the past has created a filter through which I perceive the present, by illuminating me to the fact that in detail, I have more freedom to make holistic choices in my future career.